to speak to you today about the Smithsonian's journey towards digital transformation. We have been digitizing for over 5 decades now, so our efforts might best be described as evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and we're still working to make this transformation more ingrained and seamless throughout the organization. But before I begin to talk about that, I need to give you a little bit of background about the Smithsonian. We are the world's largest museum, research, and educational complex. The public perception is that we're one entity, but the reality is that we are made up of many different components. We have 19 museums, most of which are clustered around or near the U.S. National Mall in Washington, D.C. And each of these museums has a great deal of autonomy. Collectively, pre-COVID times, these museums hosted over 30 million visitors a year. We also have 9 research centers. These are scattered further afield from our Astrophysical Research Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to our Tropical Research Center in Panama. And we have a national zoo and botanical gardens and greenhouses dispersed throughout the Washington, D.C. and Maryland area. Smithsonian staff work in over 100 countries, so our footprint is truly global. And we have a diverse funding base. About 60% of our budget is funded by the United States taxpayer. The remaining 40%, however, has to be derived from private donations, grants, partnerships with the private sector, and licensing and retail concessions. Our size and our organizational diversity makes us a nexus for research and education, but it comes with an enormous amount of challenges, particularly around digitization. Our foremost challenge involves the size of our collections. We have about 155 million objects and specimens, and that number increases daily as we are an actively collecting institution. So we have objects that we collect in multiples, such as these natural history collections, where you might have, for example, 4 million botanical specimen sheets in one collection, or 42 million paleobiological fossil specimens in another collection. We also have what would typically be seen as one-of-a-kind objects from art, history, and the cultural sector. So the diversity and the size of our collections are formidable, and equally formidable is the fact that we can exhibit very little of this collection in our facilities. We estimate that less than 1% is on exhibit at any point in time. Given the scale of our collections, it's natural that the Smithsonian began turning to automated data processing when it first came into the industry in the 1960s, primarily to gain inventory control of our vast holdings. In the early days, it was, of course, mainframe computers, which were hardwired into data entry terminals. We began capturing our first digital images in the mid-1990s. At that point in time, desktop computing also became possible, as did museum-specific systems for collections management, and the Smithsonian embraced both those things. But despite our early effort into the digitization arena, we had very little to show for it after 40 years. Only about 1 million objects had a digital image or digital record. In these early years, the digitization efforts were ad hoc and piecemeal. They were undertaken usually for a specific need, for example, planning an exhibit or managing a loan. And while this kind of digitization is important, it didn't appreciably increase the number of digital assets across the institution. Also, these efforts were usually undertaken by staff who had early adopter tendencies in terms of technology, but they also had a full plate of other duties. So these became what we call one-and-done activities. Nobody was making efforts to see that all these assets would be sustainable or reusable in the long term. So around 2009, the Smithsonian created its first digitization strategic plan. This plan acknowledged that new approaches were needed to digitization and established a formal central digitization office that would work across all the museums of the Smithsonian. This office would take a holistic approach to digitization at the Smithsonian, looking for ways to increase the number of assets, as well as their quality and their impact. This new Central Digitization Office, which was renamed the Digitization Program Office, or DPO, spent its early years exploring new methods of digitization. Today, we partner with all Smithsonian museums, but also with a number of external stakeholders, such as technology companies, educators, and researchers, to achieve our mandate, which is to increase the quality, quantity, and impact of Smithsonian digitized collections. Our mission, which is to enable discovery through digitization, takes place through 3 different programs, and I want to speak briefly about each of those. The first one is our Policy and Analysis program. This program collects digitization metrics on an annual basis, and we report on this information to the United States Congress and to Smithsonian leadership. These metrics include, for example, the total number of collections digitized within each museum and the quality of those digital assets. We also ask about how much was digitized over the last year and how much more the museum wants to digitize over the next year, the next 3 years, and the next 5 years. These kind of metrics are really important for us in DPO because they help us implement our goal by helping us prioritize our digitization efforts. Because when you have 155 million objects and limited funding for digitization, prioritization is critical. So we use these priorities to drive our second programmatic area, which is mass digitization. Mass digitization uses industrialized workflows, tools, and techniques to digitize large numbers of objects at high quality and low cost. It essentially leverages the economies that come with doing anything at scale. Of course, not everything is conducive to mass digitization. It tends to work better with large, relatively homogeneous collections. But in a collection of our scale and vastness, a lot of materials are amenable to this approach. To give you some idea of the success we've had with this approach, in the past 5 years, we've gone from 1 million objects digitized to 4.9 million, simply by using these mass digitization methodologies. What you see in this slide here are some of the industrialized setups we use. They range from rows of workstations that are set up in pipeline fashions to actual conveyor belts, which we use for flat or near flat items. Our third program is 3D digitization. We started experimenting with 3D in 2012 to better understand the technology and to identify possible use cases in the museum context. We initially scanned 20 iconic objects from around the institution to get hands-on experience with the different scanning technologies and the variety of materials that they would work with. Since then, we've 3D digitized hundreds of objects, ranging in size from small coins to the space shuttle. And we've identified a number of use cases in conservation, in education, research, and innovation. Along with the models that we've created, we've also developed a 3D viewer that enables curators and educators to give context and tell stories, and that lets users explore the models at their own pace. So I'd like to run a brief video to show you this viewer in the context of a piece of clothing, a gymnasium outfit from the 19th century. The Smithsonian recently opened an exhibit on girlhood at its National Museum of American History, and as part of that effort, the 3D team 3D digitized some clothing that's in the exhibit. And together with educators, we were able to give a little more context about the clothing using our Voyager 3D viewer. So you'll see in this video, this is the web page of the viewer. You can expand it to take up to the full screen. You can select an annotation tool from which you can annotate portions of the object with information. You can then scroll in or zoom in to look at objects that are being annotated. You can turn things around. You can turn the annotations off and use a set of other tools that are with the Voyager viewer. In this case, I believe we show measurement. We are going to measure the back bow of this particular piece of clothing. The measurements are very accurate because you're measuring point to point. But you can also, using the various tools, change the lighting if you wanted to see the wear and tear a little bit better, or if you wanted to see some particular aspect of the clothing in more detail. And if you want, the educators in this case added some catalog data as well as some imagery 2D imagery from the collections and the catalog record. So this is our 3D viewer with just one object on display, showing you how it works with some of the features and functionality. This viewer is open source if you're interested. Please do check out the Smithsonian's GitHub page. So those are our programs, and I'd like to turn now to the impact of what we're doing and how it's transforming what we do as an institution. As we scale up the creation and delivery of our digital collections through our core programs, we also recognize that we need to scale up the structures that will make our digital assets easier to use. So to that end, we're exploring new technologies, standards, and processes that make our digitized collections more useful for our users. These are a couple of examples I just want to talk through very briefly. The first one is IIIF, which is an imaging standard. And if you're not familiar with IIIF, it makes for easier real-time sharing and delivery of images in web environments. Simply put, images located anywhere on the web can, if they adhere to the IIIF standard, they can be gathered into web-based viewers where users can save and manipulate and annotate them for study or research or teaching. We're also exploring various forms of machine learning to aid both collections research and collections care. Our research use cases include species identification and distribution, and our conservation use cases include things such as identifying mercury contamination on botanical specimen sheets. We've also been using text mining on the Smithsonian's annual reports to uncover the unheralded women in Smithsonian history. And we're using computer vision in combination with optical character recognition and human transcription to facilitate metadata enrichment. It's important to note that the new tools such as machine learning require large data sets. And now that we are creating these large data sets through our mass digitization program, we're able to embrace the potential of computationally driven research methodologies. These will offer us new ways to use our collection, ways that we could not have even imagined a few short years ago. And already researchers are using them to explore things as diverse as climate change, the history of collecting, biodiversity, and cultural creativity. Another transformative event took place this past February when we released more than 3 million images and 3D models as open access, with absolutely no restrictions on use. Now, we're still monitoring the use of these collections, but I wanted to briefly show you some examples that my team has just come across in our day-to-day work. There are 4 examples here. The first one on the upper left was done by a toy designer in Japan who downloaded our 3D model of a woolly mammoth and decided to make a toy out of it. He articulated the various joints so that they could be bendable and movable. But he did something even more creative than that. He created a manga, a comic version, that instructed others on how they could do the same thing. On the upper right side, you'll see some wallpaper that was created from the cyanotypes, which is a photographic process of, in this case, flowers and plants from our Smithsonian American Art Museum. This individual, who happened to be a rare book scholar, decided to create this wallpaper, and then she wallpapered one wall of her dining room, which you see in the photograph here. Below that image, you will see a 3D model of our Triceratops from our National Museum of Natural History. A New York City artist, Amy Carl, was transfixed by the vertebral column and the shapes of the vertebral column of the Triceratops. And she used this information as inspiration to create these models and these unique sculptural forms from the vertebral elements of the Triceratops. And the final one I wanted to show you is a painting from our American Art Museum from the 19th century, an Eastman Johnson work called The Girl I Left Behind Me. an artist took this work and created a collage where she substituted the girl's dress with a heat map to create a rather fiery image. So these are sampling of some of the delightful ways that people are using our open access assets. So we've learned a lot of lessons in our digitization work, and we will continue to do so. But for us, our real pressure in the Smithsonian Digitization Program Office is to make sure we can deliver these assets more quickly and more broadly. And one of the ways we're doing that right now is with our 3D models. Up to now, 3D capture and model creation was very resource intensive. So we are trying to automate the process, and our 3D team is in full-time development mode, creating a new 3D infrastructure that builds automation into the entire 3D process, from capture through delivery to users on different platforms. This will allow us to scale up our 3D capture, moving from doing one-offs to doing entire collections, as well as help us preserve the 3D scans for the long term. We've also learned that we can create digital images faster than we can create metadata. And this is a problem because it does no one any good to have digital imagery that cannot be discovered or used to its fullest extent because of poor or absent metadata. So last year we began a concerted effort to identify metadata problems that are amenable to automated solutions, using products that already exist in the market and creating some new tools ourselves. Now, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have moved all our mass digitization resources from creating digital imagery to creating and improving digital records for the time being. And we are also addressing the need to make our digital assets as accessible as possible on our digital platforms. We're a bit behind the curve on this, but we're working to catch up fast to make sure that our websites, our social media, and all of our digital platforms are accessible to people with disabilities. Finally, I want to spend a minute on talking about how our long legacy of digitization is revealing some larger philosophical and moral issues that are making us reassess and take stock about how and why we digitize. We are starting to rethink and reconsider our digitization priorities to make sure that we're not reinforcing cultural stereotypes, to make sure that we are empowering marginalized communities, and to make sure that our efforts are benefiting those communities that we think are benefiting. For example, are the digital assets we create lending themselves to the research and the educational needs of the present and of the future? We also need to consider our digital documentation, how we are going to be addressing the bias, the prejudices, the exclusionary terminology and practices that are embedded in our digitization documentation. How can we make that documentation more inclusive as we go forward? These are a lot of questions and issues, but how we address them is going to determine how we continue to transform our institution as we go forward. So these are some of the things we're thinking about. I want to reiterate that for us, the digital transformation of the Smithsonian is a process. And although we've come far in achieving it, we still have a long way to go. Nearly all Smithsonian employees are teleworking now during the pandemic. And this situation has done a lot to make the entire institution more astute about using digital tools. And it's also made our staff, who traditionally have worked in the physical world of exhibits and education, rethink how they can do this on digital platforms. Now, we still have a long way to go to build up competencies across the institution, but we're hopeful that our transformation trajectory will continue to move forward. I thank you for your time, and I welcome your comments and your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Diane. It was a fascinating presentation, and those examples of how you have opened up and used your collections. I think they were really exciting. We now have a question, and the question is, how do you feel about having control or not having control over who and for what uses Smithsonian open access collections?
The whole point of making these collections open is to let users use them in any way they want. the control issue is really not one that we consider at all for these collections. We want people to use them. We want people to generate new ideas, new creativity, new innovations, whatever they wish and however they want. If that means using it for a commercial purpose, that's fine too. The point here is that we are giving up control, right? We know that we're not the only ones who have the answers on how things could be used, that there's a huge audience out there that we serve as part of an American institution. The American public and the global public has rights and access to these materials that are unencumbered, obviously, by copyright or any kind of other issues. And that we would love to see what the rest of the world can do with these materials. We don't hold the market on creativity and use. There's so much more out there that people could do and that we want to enable them to do with these materials. So it's a total relinquishing of control, and we're fine with that as long as they're unencumbered materials. You know, there's no privacy issues, there's no copyright issues, there's no trademark issues, no legal issues, obviously, and no cultural issues as well, because we have such a broad collection. Those are equally important to us, and we want to respect cultural communities. And so these 3 million assets that we made open are truly open in the fullest sense, legal and cultural and social. So please use them and let us know how you use them, because you know, we don't expect any kind of reporting on use, but we'd love to get that information. We love to be able to show people, like I just showed you a couple of examples. So if you do use our collections and you do something really wonderful with them, we would love to know what you do.
And connected to that, we have another question. Do you somehow measure the impact of actually opening up the collections and giving all those valuable digitized items and data to the public?
Yes, measuring impact is a tough cookie, right? It's tough to crack that. You can do the traditional things like web use and downloads, but they don't really tell you how things are used, right? So in some ways, it's a leap of faith in that people are using them, you hope they're using them, and you can monitor what you can monitor. There are probably lots of ways that we need to learn on how to assess metrics for this. And we will be looking at those going forward. I don't have an answer for you right now beyond the traditional ways that we all measure use, downloads, like I said, and when people tell us anecdotally, but it would be great if we could have better metrics on how these things are used. I agree.
Thank you very much.